All right, I have straight up 12 noon Central Standard Time, and we are going to go ahead and get started. Excited to host this webinar today. My name is Scott Willingham. I'm the Chief Customer Officer at Bulb Digital Portfolios. Bulb has been impacting education as an ePortfolio and more recently has added a digital resume and CV tool since 2016. We have higher ed customers in Europe, Brazil, India, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, serving both undergraduate and graduate programs. Utilization of Bulb across higher ed has been growing rapidly over the past year, in large part due to the impact that digital portfolios have on high impact practices. And that's exactly our topic for today's webinar. We're delighted to have Dr. Mike Simmons with us today. Dr. Simmons is the CEO of the Mike Simmons Group and also a partner with Bulb. He's formerly the Assistant Vice President of Academic Affairs, Curricular Innovation, and Academic Partnerships at the University of North Texas, where he led a team that provided education innovation strategies and faculty support for over 2,100 faculty. While at North Texas, Dr. Simmons and his team selected, implemented, supported, and administered the university-wide ePortfolio system, which was used by over 10,000 students in various high-impact practices. He was previously the Assistant Vice President for Lifelong Learning at Texas Woman's University, with responsibility for online education and continuing professional education. His work with high impact practices spans over 20 years of direct support for faculty, course development, instructional design, and research, implementing high impact practices at scale and measuring their impact on learning outcomes, and advancing the important relationship between high impact practices and job skill attainment have been areas of focus, culminating with the recent implementation of a marketable skills and comprehensive learner record on high impact practices. So that's a lot, and that's why we are excited to have Dr. Simmons with us here today. Thank you, Dr. Simmons.
Well, thank you. And that is a lot. I don't remember doing all that, but that's excellent. Thank you, Scott, and Bria as well for the opportunity. In this amount of time, we are not going to cover every element of high impact practice as possible. And those of you who are on here have probably some general idea of high impact practice, and some of you may know more than I do. So I want to kind of strike a middle balance. We're going to talk about we're going to talk about them in general, and then we're going to talk about several specifically. And we'll make this slide deck available to you afterward, which will have more details. I will be flying through some of the slides because they're just more reference than anything else. I just wanted you to have the background. So with that, let's begin. And then of course we will have, I think, some time for questions. Hopefully I'll try and be brief. And I think you should be putting those probably in the chat if you have questions, and we'll deal with them at the end, right, Scott?
Dr. Simmons, I thank you for covering for me. Yes, so I did fail to ask any of you, as you have questions specific to ePortfolios and or high impact practices, anything on the topic today, please put those in the chat, and we'll make sure that Dr. Simmons covers those towards the end of the call.
And if your questions are such that we can't get to them, we'll be happy to follow up with email or as needed. All right, so let's jump in real quick. So high impact practices, otherwise known as HIPs. So the basic idea behind high impact practice is, does it matter, right? They're named that for a reason, but there is sufficient research, and all of my slides today will have the references for the research, but largely it's by Dr. George Koo and folks who are affiliated with him who have done this research and identified 11 high impact practices that most of us are familiar with or know something about or have used in a classroom or have experienced as a student. And you'll recognize these, but what I want to really dig into is what makes them high impact and a little bit of the tricks of the trade in terms of implementing them. So what are high impact practices? And deep learning and engagement are two phrases that you will hear a lot. And transformation, that's the goal, to have a high impact. You want the learning to stay. and you want the learning to be transformative. We all want that in our teaching. And then to the main three things that sort of the bar, the threshold for becoming a HIP, assessing the achievement of deeper learning. In other words, how do you know? Are students more engaged, and how do you know? And then an element that's often overlooked in terms of high impact practices, they do tend to have a proportionally higher impact on historically underserved student populations. And that is an area of focus for many of us at this point. So that's some of the good news about high impact practices. So what are they? First year experiences, common intellectual experiences. We know those probably as core, general education, that kind of a grouping of courses across disciplines. The ePortfolio, which we'll talk about, learning communities. We won't talk about that today. Collaborative learning, we won't talk about that today. Service learning, we'll talk about. Internships, we'll talk about. Undergraduate research, we'll talk about. Writing intensives, we won't talk about today, but we'll also cover global learning and capstone. So that's the basic list. And again, you're probably familiar with most of these in some way, shape, or form. So the basic, let's look at the background, the research on this thing. So there's creating experiences, and oftentimes people think just because a student is an internship or the student does this, student does that, it makes it a high impact. Well, the answer is probably not. There are some things that have to happen in order to make the impact high on education. One of those is intentionality and assessment. We alluded to that in the previous slide. So in other words, it just doesn't accidentally happen. They have to be designated, controlled, set up, and assessed type activities. And then secondly, the deep learning. And you see the criteria for deep learning here, and most of you would know that already. But deep learning, not just superficial learning outcomes. So why? Who cares about these? Why would you invest the time and effort to do it? And there is time and effort in these. Well, institutionally, students report overwhelmingly that when they participate in high impact practice, they have a better view of the institution, the college, their major, their program, their faculty. And who doesn't want that, right? Then they self-report that they have learned more, even absent any assessment. Their self-reporting is that I learned more through that experience. It also tends to increase retention and graduation rates. Again, with certain populations, even more positively. An element that's not often talked about in the faculty side, but institutionally, students are better equipped to showcase their skills, their marketable skills, because of these experiences. And then finally, research shows that employers want to hire graduates who've done these types of experience and the skills that they lead to. And so for each one of these, I'm going to highlight what we've found and experienced, some of the skills that come out of these, in addition to and on top of the academic learning, the subject matter learning, because there's a dual benefit there. All right, so what are the conditions? And I want to walk through these very quickly, but this is what I said earlier. Doing it in and of itself is not a high impact practice. These things need to happen in order to make it high impact. So first, a significant investment of time and effort by students over an extended period of time. These are rarely one-off, like one class period exercise does not a high impact practice make. Multiple interaction with faculty and peers about substantive matters, not administrative matters, like, hey, how do I use Dropbox to turn that in on this group project? That's not what you're talking about here yet. In interaction, that turns out to be, a majority of the communication. You want to move past that. Diversity of thought, diversity of communication, diversity of interacting with people who are not like you. This is the time-intensive part for faculty, frequent, timely, and constructive feedback. So you'll know that as formative feedback, right? Throughout the process, formative feedback. And it's not the same as assessment, right? Feedback is given during the experience for the intent of growing the student. Periodic structured opportunities to reflect, very important. Real world application. Most of these high impact practices have some real world side to them or some connection to the community. And here's the interesting one: performance expectations set at appropriately high levels. In other words, and I hate to use this word, you can't dumb them down, if that's the way to say it. But you have to pull the students up to a certain level that is appropriate for the student, the class, your experience and things. And then finally, and interestingly, the public demonstration of confidence. Like if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, well, if a student learns something and no one else knows it, did they learn it? That's kind of the premise there. So those are the conditions. And I took some time on those because they really are the things that make high impact with education. All right, I'm going to skip through this real quick, but for those of you who are in education, and particularly in working with pedagogical principles, these are the kind of concepts that work: academic challenges, learning with peers, experiences with faculty, and campus environment. Those are the four pieces of the puzzle that you have to pull together to make a high impact practice. So yes, it's you as a faculty member, but it's also student to student. It's also you and the student, and it's also the overall campus environment. Those four things, those dynamics, are what makes a high impact practice work really well. And that's why an institutional commitment is often a key factor to something like this. All right, so let's just jump in to the deep end and start going through some of these experiences. So the first one I want to talk about, coincidentally, first year experiences. Many institutions have this, and they're seminars or they're a set of experiences, excuse me, that students will go through together as a freshman, or and schools handle them differently, institutions handle them differently. At the graduate level, you can do them. But the idea is bringing students together for interaction. And you can see here, it's not just the welcome to State University and here's our mascot. That's important socialization, but first year seminars and experiences must also have some more substantive content of teaching students how to learn, how to interact, how to look at their subjects, their disciplines, and things like that. Or one of the other high impact practices is common intellectual experience. Lots of times first year seminars have a common reading. Every freshman will read this book and we'll have conversations about it and we'll do activities. Those are also important ways. So you think, well, great, they're going to learn about this and learn these things, but often most important skills that come out of those would be critical thinking, communication, and teamwork. And you think to yourself, well, why does that matter? Well, it matters in the long run because the student from day one is beginning to build a set of skills that are marketable for the workplace, in addition to the educational content that they're gaining. So the four components generally in these, and you're going to see this a lot: active and collaborative learning, experience-based, right? Emphasizes academic content, again, more than the here's the school mascot and here's where the dining hall is, as opposed to in this discipline or at this school, here's the topics you're going to talk about. And if it's a disciplinary first year seminars, you're going to be an engineer, so here's your first year seminar in engineering. So here's how engineers talk, and here's our research and things like that. And then finally, it's often supported by as many staff as it is faculty. So institutional commitment to first year experience is important. Rarely do single faculty members pull off first year seminars. This is an institutional high impact practice, but it is the foundational one in which a student places their anchor of learning. And as we'll get to in the end, this is a great place for an ePortfolio, for example. Start from the beginning. I'm gaining these experiences. I'm beginning to reflect. I'm planting my stake in the ground for my education. Okay, so when we send out the link, you'll see a collection within the bulb portfolios of students who have done this. And we wanted you to be able to see them live as they've been done by students. I don't have time to do them here, but we want to go ahead and send that out to you. So you'll see those examples and can get a sense of the different flavor. And you may have those yourself, but these are represented digitally in the portfolio, and that's what makes them pretty effective. All right, I'm jumping to undergraduate research. And this is something that is increasingly prevalent, increasingly popular. And it's one of the highest impact when done well. And again, it is early exposure to the research and discipline of faculty and the discipline of research. And it's not so much, I'm a lab assistant and I'm going to bring you your samples, biology professor. I'm bringing you the samples, but here's what we're working on. So it's that next level. It's not just a errand person, which sometimes, research assistants can be. It actually involves them in the research, and that's important. Marketable skills that come out of that generally are things like critical thinking, written communication, empirical skills, and also communication and teamwork. Most times undergraduate researchers are working in teams, so they pull that. So, excuse me, couple of things I want to highlight here. Meaningful faculty mentoring. So rarely is this a wind up and let it go experience. That's the time intensity of an undergraduate research. The faculty has to be involved. And so I'm just heads up, it's not you can't set it and let it run and then come back at the end of the semester and say, how'd it go? It involves that. And then peer support. It works best. Research shows that undergraduate research works best when there are teams or peers related. And then finally, the interpreting findings rather than just collecting data. That's an important component of it. It's not always possible, but at least to have undergraduates in that conversation shows significant learning gains. Again, we have some good examples of undergraduate research in the bulb collection. And when you get this slide, please take a look at those. Some folks have done some very interesting things and shared them via a bulb digital portfolio. So service learning and community-based learning, my personal favorite, because I think this is the most impactful in the broadest sense. But basically the idea is that learning that touches the community or learning that provides service. And the definitions get murky, but I think you probably have a pretty good sense of these types of things. And they bring several of the key skills. Social responsibility is one, leadership, personal responsibility, kinds of things that you want to see of your students, but sometimes in-class experiences are a little bit harder than this to bring these skills forward. So what's meaning? Where do you make meaning of these? First, opportunities to reflect. That is the key part of a service learning or community engagement, right? So they do the work and they're in the community, and the logistics of all that is important, but you have to get the student to stop and reflect on what that meant to them in the context of their life, their progress, and their education. Secondly, does it connect in any way to the course material, right? And they have to think through that, and you have to help them think through that. And then finally, the partners on site have to be connected. Often institutions will send students out to a community site or a volunteer place or something, and then they come back and there's nothing in between. That's not a high impact practice. That's just a good education experience. And so we want to make a distinction there. All right. And so again, we have some examples of service learning in here. In this case, a student worked with the community health agency to provide some dietary assistance, and it's a pretty cool project. So I encourage you to look at that. Capstone, it's often called culminating. Capstone, it's end of, basically, right? Most times they're senior capstones. Sometimes they're capstone experiences within a single course or at the end of a set of semesters. There's different variations, but usually there's some kind of reflective, culminating collection of work, whether it's intellectual or experiential, whatever. And it's generally actually presented in a portfolio of some sort. If it's in the arts, it's one way. If it's in engineering, it can be a project. If it's, yeah, they're different in each category. And also sometimes internships are the capstone experience for folks. And we'll talk about internships in a minute, but you can easily see the skills that come from capstone courses and projects. Easy to figure this out. Right? They have to be structured, time, communication with the faculty, integration with the disciplinary knowledge, et cetera. Those are, it's one of the easier ones to implement if you have a successful collaboration across all the partners, right? Again, a single faculty member has a hard time doing a quality capstone, but it can be done, can be done. And as I said, internships, not all interns are capstones and not all capstones are internships, but internships as a high impact practice are reported in most of the research that surveys students about education satisfaction. Internships are reported as the highest value. And that's probably because they're directly tied to them getting a job and things like that. And we all know the research that students who have an internship are X times more likely to get a job and X times more likely to succeed in that job. That's well documented, but in its educational form, it's experiential learning. And so even non-traditional programs that add an internship have an impact. So we think of internships as common in many of the service disciplines, et cetera, but I'm familiar with some, for example, some English majors that have internships and a couple of philosophy and religion programs that have internships. And again, you would think that those are not directly related because there's no direct profession, but they really work to enhance the disciplinary knowledge and add a value to the student. This is the application part. An internship is application, and that's the real key to it. We have examples in the slides we'll send you, so please take a look at those. I want to hop through just two more here real quick. The global learning, cultural competence, and study abroad, those kinds of words you'll hear, but it's all under the heading of global learning as a high impact practice. And so whether you're exploring cultures in a different country or cultures different than your own, that's the idea in a global learning experience. And often it ties to a study abroad or some kind of going away experience, but it doesn't always have to do that. We have some pretty good examples of global learning in the bulb collection. This is probably the most well-known high impact practice. People are pretty familiar with study abroad and cultural initiatives. And generally, a university has an office or an institution has a person who does this. So there's not as much burden on a faculty for these kinds of things. And I want to close here and give us enough time for questions, but ePortfolio, which is sort of the hip of hips, right? It's the super hip. What you'll note here is ePortfolios several years ago were added as their own high impact practice, just in and of themselves. The creation and use of an ePortfolio is a high impact practice, but you'll note most of these other high impact practices lend themselves best to some sort of a portfolio, an ePortfolio. So it's sort of a multiplier impact. And that's why, we feel like this is an important, high impact practices are so important in the context of talking about bulb digital portfolios, because no matter the practice, there's a very, very valuable use of the portfolio concept. So that notion of a portfolio is collection over time, reflection over time, assessment over time, and culmination of all that. So, right, you're just collecting, reflecting, assessing. It's a build. And then it's a showcase, right, which is the other side of it. Showcase either internally to you as a faculty or a showcase externally for employment. So we have some pretty good examples. Well, we have some really excellent examples of the portfolio because we've just talked through them. All these other experiences we've talked through today, plus more, are well represented in digital portfolios, and you'll get a chance to look through those. We don't have time to do it today, but in the material we send, please take time and look at that and see. And then I want to close with this. You know, there's people who say, well, how do you know it's a hit? Well, we gave the criteria up front, but in the end, so how do you look at it yourself? Did this matter? And there's 4 questions. Could your students demonstrate that they had risen to a challenge? What did learning from others look like? How could a student adjust their performance? And then could they apply this to real life? Those are the really, really big, high impact questions, just philosophically, that you want to ask. You know, the practical ones we already listed, but these are the kind of things you think about when you think about your teaching, you think about your program, you think about education. Those are the kind of, that's like the holy grail of education, these questions. And that's generally where high impact practices lead if they're implemented correctly. So I know we're at, I want to stop there. We could talk for hours about this and I'd be happy to do that, but to value your time, I want to leave some time for questions. And let me ask Scott and Bria, are there any questions we need to answer, or has anybody brought anything up that we need to go back and address in the commentary?
Questions in the chat, and we have just a few minutes left, so any that we don't get to, we'll definitely send out. If you want to add more questions, still have some time to do that. So first question is, what's a good first step in getting started with an ePortfolio?
Well, the good first step is to ask yourself why you would want an ePortfolio. It can be often viewed as a shiny object. And I've seen people, seen faculty, seen students say, well, if I just had an ePortfolio, then everything would be solved. Well, as you can see, the practices, experiences, artifacts, and evidence and assessment that are part of an ePortfolio are really what makes it. So the why question needs to be asked before anything else. And once you have that in mind, you have a particular purpose, then you can start asking, okay, well, what do I need in order to accomplish that? So really you have to ask why. What are you going to use portfolio for? That's always the first step. Now, a practical step then becomes, well, you know, what kind are there and who and all that kind of stuff. But really, you're wasting your time until you think through the why you would want it. That's my answer.
No, that's great. I'm curious because you've obviously implemented these with thousands, tens of thousands of students and many, many faculty members. So what is maybe a practical step? Once you've answered the why and you've chosen a platform, we've got a great one to recommend if any of you are wondering or curious out there. So what's a great first step for rollout?
So if you're a faculty member doing this on your own in your class, it's a different question than if you're an institution looking at it. And I've done both. So at the individual level, you have some considerations that have to do with what you're trying to accomplish, you know, what your class infrastructure is, what the project looks like, and all that. And so the various products out there, you're looking at those based on that. At an institutional level, you've got obviously some broader considerations of integration and things like that. But really, if you're looking at it from an individual level, it's about, well, honestly, sometimes it's about permission, right? As a faculty member or a teacher, sometimes the levels of bureaucracy, you have to go through that. If you have the freedom and flexibility to look on your own, then obviously it's a pretty simple, straightforward question of what do I need in such a structure? Because here's what I want to do with it.
All right, I am going to we have one more question that I think we have time for, and I think it's a great question. So Dr. Simmons, how do students in your experience usually respond to the use of ePortfolios in the various high impact practices that you covered today?
Well, I could make up a nice answer here and say they love it, but any of us who have taught understand that students do not generally respond well to things like group projects or portfolio projects because it requires substantive work and effort, which what makes it high impact. So that's not to be disparaging, and simply to say they don't take to it like a duck to water unless it's introduced well. So, right, once they see the context of it and the purpose of it, of a portfolio, students are on it. And the funny thing is, students sort of have in their mind a rolling portfolio. They're building their own resume, sort of. They just don't do it on their academic side of academic knowledge. They sort of do it on their experiences as they get through school. They think, I took this class, I did this internship. They've got a running thing in their mind. Wouldn't it be nice if they tied that to their academic experiences in your classroom, their co-curricular, all the things they're doing, and made that reflective connection throughout? That's the value of the portfolio. Once they see that, right? I've always found that students have to be let in on the secret of why you're doing this. Now, some faculty members don't agree with that, but with educational technology, especially portfolios, there's such a value proposition for a student. I think it's fair game to sell it to them. Say, here's why we're doing this. It requires a little work, but it's worth it. And in the end, by the way, you'll have this showcase of things that you've done. I know this is an assignment that's right here in this class and you don't see it, but if you put all these together, look what it's going to have. That's a sales pitch that works for adoption or acceptance, I guess is a better way, by students to invest.
No, that's great. And I know we are at time and we want to be respectful for your time. Dr. Simmons, want to thank you again for being with us today and hope for more of these to come in the near future. To our attendees, thanks for, you were invited because you have signed up for your own bulk portfolio in the past. And so we're excited about that. Glad that you have visited Bulb before and have a Bulb account. We are excited to serve you and your students any way we can in the future. So be looking for more invitations to webinars, more resources to come out, as well as the recap. This video you could share with colleagues, as well as the slides and exemplars in Bulb that you can check out as you have the time. I know semester's either already over or is winding down this week, probably for most of you. So hope it was a great one and that you have a great summer. And we look forward to seeing you again on a webinar or talking with you in the near future. So thank you, everybody. That concludes our webinar, and have a great rest of your week.